All right. So we are starting today a new series. We're trying to do series that are roughly a month long. This one's going to be a bit longer because we're incorporating Miller students. So it'll go from now until we take a break for Christmas. It's a series on the covenants of the Bible. The church has recognized about since the beginning, you could go back and see this fairly clearly in as early as Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century. You can get pretty strong hints of it if you go back even to the 1st century. And I would argue you see it in the New Testament. The church has always understood that covenants are one of the major keys to understanding the Bible. This is seen also in what we call the Bible. We have the New Testament and the Old Testament. Does anyone know what testament means? Covenant. And that distinction goes back to the beginning. You find people as early as the 100s or 200s referring. The difference, it depends whether or not you accept as legitimate. Most people don't. Some of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. But if you accept his letters as legitimate, which you shouldn't, then as early as the days of John the Apostle, people were talking about the books of the Old Covenant and the books of the New Covenant, or the New Testament and the Old Testament. And so they understood that central to understanding the Bible, even in the name that they called it, was the covenants. But what is a covenant? That's what I want to cover today. I'm going to cover the Noahic covenant as an introduction to the covenants that all the Miller students are going to cover. I'm not going to cover any more of the covenants. They got all of them. I'm very happy. But what is a covenant? Does anyone remember, before I even ask that, we had a discussion recently about Aristotelian metaphysics. And we talked about what are the accidents and an essence of a thing. Does anyone remember that? The essence of a thing is what is vital to it, absolutely unchanging. The accidents could change. You give the example of this cup. This cup could be full or empty. Mine's full, but it would be a cup nevertheless. It could be full of this, full of that. It could be any color. Those are all accidents. But there's something about it that makes it a cup, that's essential to being a cup. There are things that are accidental to covenants, that differ from covenant to covenant. Some covenants have conditions. Some don't. It doesn't need conditions to be a covenant. Some covenants have witnesses. Jacob puts up a rock between him and Laban and says, this rock will be a witness between you and me. The Mosaic covenant has witnesses. Moses says, I call heaven and earth to testify against you today. And so when Isaiah, hundreds of years later, writes, he begins his book, Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children I've reared up, they've rebelled against me. He's pointing out, you've rebelled against the covenant, just like God said you would. And I'm calling heaven and earth to testify, because they're the witnesses. Some covenants have signs, but not all do. The Noahic covenant we'll look at today has the rainbow. It's the sign. It's just like in English, the word bow is a weapon. And this bow is aimed away from anybody. God's not aiming his bow at us. It appears it's not aimed at us. He is not going to flood the world again. Circumcision is a sign, but not every covenant has signs. So there's these things that are accidental to covenants, but before we talk about covenants, what's essential to it? What is a covenant?
Something between two parties.
Yes?
There has to be more than one person involved.
True. I know some particular Reformed people who might disagree with you, but I think you're right. If you had to give a synonym, what else could we call a covenant?
Promise.
Yes, almost. They're very linked. Let's look at Hebrews 8, actually, on that note. You'll see that promises are essential to covenants, but it isn't synonymous with covenants. Hebrews 8, we'll just look at verse 6. To look at the way it uses the words covenant and promise. As it is, Christ, I'm reading ESV, has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent, or is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So the covenant isn't the promise, but it's enacted on promises. A word for covenant would be agreement. When Jacob and Laban agree, I'm not going to go over past this rock, and you're not going to go over past this rock. It's an agreement that somebody makes with somebody else, but it is based on promises. It's an agreement where I promise to do this, and you promise to do that. When God makes a covenant, and this is why your answer is a great one, when God makes a promise or a covenant, sometimes he doesn't require anything. We see that with the Noahic covenant. There's nothing that God tells them. Well, I shouldn't say there's nothing God tells them to do. He does tell them to do things. But it's not an agreement in the same sense where it's like, I do this and you do that. It's just, I do this. That's it. I will never flood the earth again. There are no conditions. I will never reduce mankind to 8 people. He does have commandments for them. He tells them, this time around, because of violence, I flooded the earth. Now you're made in the image of God. You're supposed to rule. Now, I'm paraphrasing this, but you can read it and see if it's there. Now you're going to be in charge of keeping a tab on violence. If somebody kills a man, by a man shall his blood be shed, not by a flood. From here on, it's man's responsibility to keep murder in check. We can't have rampant violence everywhere. Now, we're terrible at that. We've been getting worse at it. World War I and World War II were probably the greatest death tolls of wars in all history. But God has still promised not to flood the world, and that promise isn't changed. Does that make sense? A covenant is an agreement. It's based on promises. Questions? Yes.
In agreement, there's that two-party aspect of one of both agreeing to the terms. Would that be accurate in the picture of a covenant?
Yes. There's a sense that both agree to the terms, but there's also a sense that God is a lot bigger than you are. And if God makes a covenant, you look at the Mosaic covenant, there is a sense that they have to agree to the terms. God, in fact, he commands them to say, "Cursed are all those who do not keep all the words of this law." And he commands them to promise that they're going to keep it. There is a sense that agree in our minds might bring up connotations of mutually agreeing this is a good idea. But when God appeared to them at Sinai, it says that they stood at the foot of the mountain. Well, the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, with cloud and great thick darkness and gloom. And he spoke with a voice like thunder, so that they might learn to fear him all their days. Now, in that situation, there is a sense that there's an agreement, but there's also a sense that you can't really say no. You can't just say, "Yeah, thanks for bringing us out of Egypt, God, but I wasn't really into this promised land thing. I just didn't like being a slave, so I'm off. I'm going to go do my own thing now. You have fun with this nation-building stuff." So it is with Noah. God just flooded the whole earth, and he makes a covenant with them. And in this case, there isn't really any agreement going on. He doesn't have Noah agree to anything because he's just making a covenant. And God actually makes it not just with Noah. This is a problem with the naming. Most of the names of the covenants are based on who it's with. Who's the other party? It's God and the Abrahamic covenant. It's God and Abraham. The Noahic covenant. It's God and Noah. The Mosaic covenant. It's God and Israel. Bad name for it. Levitical covenant. God and Levi. But sometimes the names are unhelpful because Noahic is actually not just with Noah. He says it's made with all flesh. All the birds, all the fish. And the fish aren't agreeing to anything. So it's an agreement usually, but if it's just God making an assertion, then the agreement is sort of unessential, accidental to it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That clarifies it. Thank you.
Other questions on what is a covenant? Before we talk about specifically the Noahic covenant and a bit about how the covenants hold the Bible together. Some of you look like you might have questions if I give you a few more moments. Okay. One thing I want to point out about covenants, I'm pointing out some things that are true of all of them so that these Miller students will have some pointers maybe for their lessons. The covenants are based on creation because God's purpose is unchanging. Hebrews puts it this way. He swore an oath to show more clearly the unchangeable nature of his purpose. You know, when God makes these promises, and sometimes he makes them multiple times. Like the Abrahamic covenant, he makes it in 4 steps. And at the very last step, he says, now I know that you love God. I swear by myself. Why does God need to swear? He can't lie. He's making it more clear to us the unchangeable character of his purpose. But it is unchangeable. And it's unchangeable going back to creation, because in the beginning he said, let us make man in our image and let him have dominion over the earth. And he said, go forth and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And he put Adam in a garden. He gave him a Sabbath for rest. Well, we don't know that he gave him the Sabbath, but it was clearly a place of rest. He was made to guard it, to keep it. He was made to enjoy his relationship with God, with his wife. Everything around him was given to him as a gift. Clearly, you'd say God's purposes for men were good. And when Adam sinned, he was driven out of the garden. But God's purposes didn't change. His purposes was to give life. But when death entered the world, God didn't change his mind and go, well, that's that, no more life. When he makes the covenants, the language of them is constantly pointing you back to creation. So that you get almost a repeat as we look here at Genesis 9 and look at the Noahic covenant. Let's just read the first several verses of Genesis 9. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and fill the earth. That's almost verbatim what Genesis says to Adam. That this was the blessing given in the very beginning in God's good purposes. And now those good purposes are being taken up in the covenants. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. That's very much like what God said in the garden. He gave them every plant. There's a change here, but it's still the same language. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it from every man. Go ahead to verse 7, because that's not relevant to this point. And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, every beast of the earth with you, and as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. Again, he's listing these in orders of creation. Not in the exact order, but I mean, these are the creatures that he created. He created them to have life, and the Noahic covenant has not altered that. He still wants them to have life. He still created them, and he still wants good for them and for all his creation. And then he states what the covenant is. Verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. These concepts of creation run straight through the Bible. Right from Genesis to Revelation, where you get the new heavens, the new earth. It looks like a new Eden. It's the same language of plants, of life, a river of life. Even when you look at the Exodus, let's just look at one more passage on this. Exodus 1. Now, in Hebrew, it's such a funny sounding phrase that you can't miss it. Peru, uruvu, umulu et ha'aretz. It just sounds so funny. You can't miss those words put together. Peru, Peru, uruvu, umalu. Verse 7 of chapter 1 in Exodus. The people of Israel, Peru, uruvu, umalu. They were fruitful, increased greatly, and they multiplied, and they grew exceedingly strong, so that the land, Umalu, was filled with them. This is what God told Adam. It's what God told Noah. It's being fulfilled in his people. Even when you get to the New Testament, it says God added to their number day by day. The New Testament is increasing. It's be filled with the Spirit. He's using the language of the covenants. God had a plan in creation to do good to man, and man messed it up. But God is faithful, though every man's a liar. As we go through this series, you'll see God makes covenants throughout the Bible, and all of them are bringing man back to the garden, essentially. Now, there's differences. As you go through the Bible, you take note of the covenants. I think the more you understand the covenants, the more you'll understand the Bible. Your daughters both should know it really well. We spent a whole year on one of the covenants. If they don't remember it, it's not my fault. But if you understand what the promises are, if you even just memorize the few little promises, you'll see every chapter of the Bible is about how those play out, how God keeps the promises he makes. The Abrahamic covenant, probably you see that the strongest with. He says, I'll bless you, I'll make your name great, I'll make you a great nation. And all of that is picked up in Jesus, of course. He's the one who's given the name above every other name. He's the one that he refers to the church as a nation. He says, I'll take the kingdom away from you, Pharisees, and give it to a nation that's more worthy. He's the one, God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I'll be cursed. Ultimately, that's about Jesus. What do you do with Jesus? Bless him or curse him? But all of them are taking you back to the garden. What you want to notice is the similarities, how these things are all pointing you back to the garden, but you also want to notice the differences. I'll focus on Noah, so I don't take everyone else's thunder. But even with Noah, you get similarities and you get differences. He's giving them the same blessings. But I'll ask you, what are some major differences? He's kind of brought them back to the garden, but how has he not really brought them back to the garden?
There's fear and terror between men and the animals.
Yeah. You don't get the sense that there was any fear. Shame entered the world, and fear. They run in fear when they hear the sound of God walking after they sin. There's no mention of fear before they sin. Their relationship with God is supposed to be one. I mean, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But there's not supposed to be this trembling and terror at the sound of the Lord. That only entered because of sin. And just as their relationship with God was frustrated by sin, now man's relationship with the world is frustrated by sin in the same way. There's fear. But the fear is better than you're afraid of them, right? There's times when the beasts are so ravenous that, there's dinosaurs or whatever, and you're afraid of them. That's a usurpal of creation order. This is bringing you back. This is man ruling over the beasts. That is how it's supposed to be in the garden. But it's not like it was. What else do we see? Noah goes into a garden. That's similar. He's naked and unashamed. That's similar. They're on a mountain. That's similar. There's some really big major ones.
We're told they can eat meat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very different one. Death had not entered the world in the garden. Eating meat implies killing. And who's the first one to kill anything in the Bible? Yeah. God. I mean, that or he just made skin. But is it skin if it didn't come off a dead animal? Yeah, God is the first one to kill in the Bible. And death is still here. That's the big one. Adam and Eve would not have died. Here, not only have they not been returned to everlasting life, but God in his what he says with Noah actually says, because man is so evil, their days are going to be numbered from here on. Now the days of man's life will be 120 years. So that does tie you back to the garden. But it's not a move towards, it's a move away from. So God's saying two things at once. On the one hand, he's demonstrating his commitment to bring them back, to give them life. On the other hand, he's reinforcing the curse and restating, man is still evil. His heart is sinful from his youth. And that hasn't changed. Anything else?
The question, did Adam die in the flood?
No. No, he died well before the flood. Methuselah died in the flood. And he was, if you look at the genealogies, he lives the longest. But actually, it's probably the idea is he almost made it to 1,000. The reason he didn't is because of the flood. And his name means man of the spear or javelin. And the flood comes for violence. Lamech, Noah's father, who's told, he says that he'll give us rest from the work of our hands. He dies at 777, which is like the perfect age of a life, 777. And he dies 5 years before the flood, to give you this contrast. This guy who's full of violence, he dies in the flood, and it's an imperfect number. Even though it's bigger, it's imperfect. It's not 1,000 like you'd think. Lamech, who's seen as blessed in the story, he dies full of years. Other questions? 1,656 years if you were trying to figure out how much time between Adam and the flood. Adam dies at 912, so he would have had to have lived about 700 and some years longer. The first person, I mean, we don't know when Cain and Abel did their murder stuff, but the first person we read of to die, or to not die, I should say, would be Enoch. Before anybody dies, he's taken up to make the point to everybody, you don't have to die. You could follow God like this guy. God's intention was never death. Anything else different with where Noah's brought to? There's one big one that I want us to notice. Seasons is not really mentioned in the garden, so it's hard to say. Yeah, you could maybe guess that seasons were invented at a later date, but seasons, well, you go back to creation, he created the stars for seasons to remind people when the seasons are. So the seasons haven't changed. Actually, when he brings up seasons, he does it in the context of showing that it's an everlasting covenant. It's as everlasting as the seasons, which are part of God's created order, and man's sin has not affected in the slightest.
Sorry.
Yep.
Would a difference be that this is a unconditional covenant?
I don't like the language of unconditional covenant, and I'll tell you why. But first I'll say that's not really a difference because there's no covenant mentioned in the garden.
Okay.
And this is a major point I want to make, so I'm glad you brought it up. The covenants build on each other. They all go back to creation, but they all build on one another as God is progressively revealing his plan. There's a sense that Noah's a second Adam. Adam disobeys and brings death to the whole world. Noah obeys and brings life, preserves life in the whole world. Adam rules all the animals, Noah rules all the animals. God puts Adam to rest on a mountain, God puts Noah to rest on a mountain. God makes Adam, and he's naked and unashamed in a garden. Noah gets drunk, and he's unashamed and naked in a garden. There's a sense that God's showing his purpose is to save the world through someone who's like Adam, but unlike Adam. Somebody who, instead of disobeying and bringing death, brings life and undoes everything that Adam did. And you get the sense Noah is not quite that guy. Joseph is more that guy as you go later on. But there's no covenant with Adam that is mentioned in Genesis. I would argue it is significant because the covenants build on each other. It's significant which one you make the first one, because that's the one everything else is grounded in. If the Noahic covenant is the first one, and it's the first one mentioned, then all the covenants are grounded on the fact that God always keeps his word. Because all the covenants are grounded on what you called an unconditional covenant. I don't like calling it that, but it's a good term for the Noahic covenant because it has no conditions. It's just God is faithful. And you see it because ever since this covenant's been made, he's never flooded the world. I will end in a minute for your sake. Many would like to make some other covenant. Some people make predestination actually an eternal covenant, predates creation. And then every other covenant, predestination becomes more important than God's faithfulness. Some people would make a covenant with Adam the first, so that Adam's sin and failure, that all becomes more fundamental. I think this one's put first intentionally to make the point, as God makes his promises, you have to read all of them in faith that God always keeps his word, no matter what. Does that answer your question? I should mention why I don't like calling it unconditional covenant. Some people divide up the covenants like this. There's unconditional and conditional covenants. The problem is when you get to the Abrahamic covenant, because there's a sense that it's unconditional, meaning God will unconditionally keep his word. That's foundational. God always does what he says. But there's also a sense that there's conditions, and you can have both. You can have God say, if you obey me, I will bless you. And you can have God say, I will bless you. That's a given. I will bring it about. And he has the power to bring about obedience. Ultimately, obedience is the condition of the major covenants in the Bible. And Jesus obeys. And he confirms the promises by that obedience. So, last call for questions, and then this has just been an introduction to covenants. Covenants are complicated, but the better you understand them, the better you'll understand the Bible. I've tried to steer clear of the many controversies about them. All right. Terry, can I get you to close in prayer?
Covenants that you made with man, and I just pray, Lord, that as time goes on in this class, Lord, that we learn to understand you better and how you want us to live. Just thank you for this time, and we pray that you would bless the service after this. In your name we pray.